Okay, welcome back to another author interview at Crystal Lake. And today our guest is Joe Filipas. I hope I got that right.
Yes, ma'am.
And he's one of the co-authors of the new book Harvest Time. So I'm going to let him introduce himself now. So take it away.
Thanks so much. My name is Joe Filipas. As Anita said, I'm one of the co-authors of Harvest Time, and I'm so excited for all of the work that's been going into this story for over a decade now is going to be out in front of people for them to read and enjoy, and hopefully they love it as much as we do.
Okay, so give everyone a quick overview of what the book Harvest Time is about.
Yeah, so at a very high level, Harvest Time is the story of two brothers and their partners going on a cross-country road trip, and things start to go wrong, and then they start to go very, very wrong. I've thought thematically about what it's about, and aside from just the literal physical things that they are put up against, when I think about Harvest Time, I think about it as in part just a story of decay, and not only decay of just like personal relationships, identity, but also I think you could look at it as a story about decay in society or decay of America and what do we do and what bargains are we willing to make, Faustian bargains are we willing to make to prevent that decay from affecting us directly.
Interesting. So this book is co-authored. You have two
Mhm.
other authors. So how did you get involved in the book collaboration?
So Dan and I went to college together. We were both film students, and we collaborated on a couple of projects as undergrads. And after we graduated, we were both still living in Chicago, and his childhood friend Chris had moved up to hang out with him, and they had an idea that they were kind of kicking around, and they wanted to put together a screenplay. And Dan and I, being previous collaborators, he said, "Hey, I think this is something you might be able to sink your teeth into and help us think about." And over the course of many a cold night in Chicago, over some cheap pizza and cheap beer, maybe about 12 or 13 years ago, we hacked out a screenplay version of this story. And after getting a full draft put together and kind of revised a little bit, we kind of looked at it, sat on it, and weren't quite sure what to do with it. And I think, truthfully, we would say, looking back on that draft we put together, it felt like maybe only about half a story or maybe two-thirds. It didn't really feel like it had a third act. And afterwards, we all kind of moved back to our home states and kind of put it in the cabinet for a little while, as you tend to do with some of these projects. And I think for in particular for Dan, uh, I think he wasn't quite able to let it go as easily as Chris and I were. And after doing a couple of other writing projects that Dan had done on his own, he has a couple of wonderful collections of short stories, and he's developed quite a remarkable voice and in prose for long form writing. I think he came back to this and he contacted both Chris and I and said, "Hey, I think I have some ideas on how we can build this out a little bit more." So over the course of a couple of phone calls over maybe a couple of years now, Dan would occasionally call me up and say like, "Hey, I got this idea for how we could do something different with JT and Katie. What do you think about this? What do you think about that?" And we'd kind of talk through it, and I'd just be like pacing around out in the sidewalk in front of my apartment or in the yard in front of our house, and we'd kind of talk it through a little bit. Dan would go back and he'd hack out some pages and occasionally send out an update for us to read and judge. So the screenplay that we started with was much more of a collaborative effort, very directly. And then I think coming into the novelization, still very much a collaborative effort, but with Dan kind of leading the way in the way the prose was written. I think the a lot of the feedback and input I had in this iteration of the story was more so about the characters and the beats, occasionally on some of the wording and phrasing, but for the most part, I left Dan just kind of work his magic on the page. And I'm really, really proud of what of the story that we came up with together, but also how Dan has brought that to life in a really compelling novel version.
Okay, so what was it like co-writing a book as opposed to say a screenplay or working on a film?
Well, I think a screenplay, first of all, is it's a really fun format to write in because it is so abbreviated. When you're really humming along, it is such short words and sentences on this page. There's a lot of propulsion to it. And writing a novel versus a screenplay, obviously, there's a lot more space for you that you are able to fill and story that you're able to tell, both not only beyond what is literally happening in each particular scene or what each particular character is saying or what they look like, but how they're feeling and background and things like that. So, a screenplay for a typical movie might be when it's properly formatted 90 to 100 pages, and obviously a novel you're going to have not only a lot more pages but a lot more dense amount of words on the page as opposed to a script. So I think for us writing the screenplay collaboratively, we would all take our own kind of passes at it in our own, little bit of screenwriting software, because it's pretty easy to copy and paste and put those things together and kind of format those things. But I think collaboratively writing a novel, I'm not sure we would have been successful if we were all trying to write like our own version of a chapter and then put it together, because there's just too much to get into. There's too much to evaluate and think through how it all fits together. The voice may not be as consistent. So I think the way that we went about it probably was the way that uh, I, I don't know if you could honestly go about a different way of collaboratively writing a novel. And then when you talk about filmmaking, Dan and I made some short films together quite a while ago now, and filmmaking itself is a really inherently collaborative process. You have a director, producer, writer, cinematographer, and sometimes those might be the same people, especially when you're working on a small scale production, but still outside of a few scant examples, maybe like Bo Burnham's Netflix special, you're not one person putting together a vision. There's multiple people who are involved in it. So I think the challenge with filmmaking versus writing specifically, both are very time intensive. But with filmmaking, you need to have a lot more people coordinated and able to dedicate their time. Whereas when you're talking about more pure just writing on the page, it's still obviously an incredible amount of time to dedicate to it, but it is not dependent in the same way of having everyone be in the same place at the same time working together the way when you're actively in film production. And the other part of it too is that you go out and you shoot a film, whatever length it is, you take all that footage and you're able to create something out of that in the edit. And if you're not quite sure everything is lining up the way you want to on screen, there are some tricks and things you can do to build it or re-edit it or reformat it. But at the end of the day, what you shot is what you shot. And unless you want to go back and rewrite it and reshoot it again, that's kind of like the base building blocks that you're working with. But of course, with a novel, if you don't like how something is working out, you just take those pages, you put them in the virtual trash bin or put them in a folder for reference later if you want to go back to them, and you just start over again. So I think that's certainly a draw of writing versus filmmaking, especially as me and all the co-authors were a lot older than we were and had a lot different life situation than when we first started working on that screenplay. Just a bunch of single guys hanging out, in a drafty Chicago apartment. Whereas now, we all have families, we all have jobs that are maybe a little bit more time constrictive than we had when we were in our early 20s. So I think this style of creation certainly I think is easier for us to manage in addition to being halfway across the country from each other, them being in Texas and myself being in Minnesota.
Yeah, it's definitely easier to edit a novel than video or film.
Right. No less time intensive
No,
at all, but at the same time, like I said, a scene doesn't work. You're not sure you like how a character's coming across. You just start a new page. You
yeah.
don't have to go back and do a reshoot. You don't have to cut around it. You don't have to try to figure out some other way to get your vision to life in the medium that you want.
Okay, so what kind of trials did the three of you put your characters through in the book?
Oh, there's a lot of things that do go wrong for them, and a lot of things that might seem somewhat familiar for fans of the horror and suspense genres. I think there's, in addition to maybe some of the peculiar and maybe apparently supernatural elements that they are kind of trapped with. What I think really helps this story, and I think comes to life a lot better in the novelization than our original screenplay, is sort of the interpersonal challenges that these characters are working through. The two brothers and trying to mend some of their relationship challenges that they've been through in their life, as well as maybe one of the main character's wife not quite seeing eye to eye on just like how they view the world and how they're trying to go through it together. Without those elements of that personal struggle, I think it's really hard to make something that's going to be compelling for, let alone, 90 minutes or hour 40 in a theater watching a film. But certainly, like, sticking with a book for several hundred pages, if you don't have that element to make you care about what happens to the character, that journey they go on, aside from just like getting away or being safe from whatever danger you put them in front of, without having something bigger to root for, I think it's hard to want to see a character through. So I think both of those elements, we thought a lot about how those can come to life on the page and help propel the characters through the actions that they take to get out of the scenario that they're in, and hopefully look at their lives with a breath of fresh air. Something Dan and I always love talking about is one of our most beloved screenwriting professors back when we were at college would always talk about the genre of horror, and supernatural in particular, is that you look at a lot of horror suspense novels or horror suspense films, and he had this way of talking about that a character needed to be open to the uncanny. There's something different or out of the ordinary happening to them, and that was usually started by some sort of a change in their life. So you see a lot of horror films start with someone moving into a new space, or the specific reference I remember us talking about quite a bit was the film What Lies Beneath with Harrison Ford and Michelle Pfeiffer, and that movie begins with their adult daughter going to college and leaving home, and that change in their life helps just kind of put them off balance and make them perhaps in an emotional state just like more aware, more open to something out of the ordinary happening to them.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
So, what's your favorite scene in the book without spoilers?
Without spoilers, there's one sequence early on where our characters are at a kind of a bizarre roadside attraction that is in a lot of ways very similar beat for beat to what we had in the original screenplay it's based off of, and it's a little peculiar, it's a little funny, it's a little bizarre, and there's a couple of moments there that still make me laugh out loud, even though I've heard this story beat over and over again. And then there's an element in the towards the end of the story that I really enjoy a lot, and I think is one of those things I was talking about earlier, where you want an emotional payoff for the characters in a story. Two of the main characters towards the end, they don't realize that they're kind of working together because they're not in the same physical space, yet they are still actually kind of helping each other work through the situation that they find themselves in. And the parallel of the two of them doing it independently and seeing how it comes together is really satisfying for me. I really love reading those passages.
That sounds cool.
Mhm.
So, what was the hardest scene you wrote or collaborated on in the book?
Um, Me personally, I love the act of writing, creating, whether it's a short story or whether it's a screenplay, because you develop a character, it's hard not to love the characters that you put down on the page. And I'm very much like a softie at heart. So there's one moment in both versions of our story, in the script and in the novel, where something bad happens to one of the characters that you really like, and it's it's a real gut punch, and it's even harder for me to write, or rather, it's harder for me to read in the novelization. Just the prose that Dan brings to the story and the way he fills in the details. It's even though we're not directly witnessing what happens, we are very easily able to infer what happens to this one character. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh gosh, if we weren't writing a horror novel, I wouldn't want anything bad to happen to this person. They don't deserve this. I don't want this to happen. So it's I just have to remind myself, no, these people are real. This is all made up. But still it's still painful for me to kind of imagine this happening to a character who uh, really doesn't deserve what's happening to them.
Yeah, well, don't worry. A
Mhm.
lot of authors feel that way. I'm not one of them,
Yeah.
but so, you mentioned you're also a filmmaker. So what's the
Yeah.
creative process, like for being a filmmaker as opposed to writing the novel? What are the similarities and the differences?
I think in the long form writing that I've done independently of this project and the many screenplays I've written or half written, I think at the beginning of it you still have to think through, no matter what the final form of it is, who are the characters, what's important to them, what's standing in their way, what trials are they going to go through, and what's that going to do to them, and then what is the actual like plot machinations happening within the story to go from point A to point B to point C, both in terms of like location or things happening, as well as the different beats in each of the acts that you have, whether it's 3 or 4, or however your story is structured. So I think from planning out what that story is going to be and what you want to have happen and what you think is going to be interesting and uh, emotionally relevant to anyone who's either watching a film or reading a book. Those beginning planning stages, I think, in a lot of ways are very, very similar. But then you start getting into the actual making of the thing, and with a novel, you have to start building out all of those different pieces and figure out like how much time do we want to spend on this particular scene? Do we want to go back and have a flashback? Do we have some background here and there? And making sure that that prose is flowing and compelling and interesting while uh, giving enough context to help tell the full story that you want to, as well as continuing to move things forward, either from an emotional or a plot point, um, to keep the reader interested. And then from building out the framework of what'll be a film, the screenplay is you still want it to be emotional. You want that to be enjoyable to read and be a very easy get for anyone who's going to be participating in the making the film, whether it's an actor or a producer, or cinematographer, to understand kind of like the emotional parts. So in some ways, a good screenplay will read a little bit like a very abbreviated novel, but that's only the first step. You go through a writing edit phase the same way you will on a novel, but then you have to figure out how to produce it, who's going to act in it, work with your crew to make sure that you get the look and feel that you want, that you get the type of performances that you want, so that final package matches up to your vision. But also, because filmmaking is so collaborative, just being excited and accepting that like there's going to be other things that come into the creation of that when you actually go about shooting and producing it, and when you go about editing it, that it's going to probably look and feel different from what you originally imagined, and that's okay. But compared to the work of writing and rewriting a long form story versus producing, there's so many more components that you have to consider and so many more things that go wrong. Whereas, this day and age, you just got to make sure that your save file works correctly on your computer. You have electricity, you have the time to write it. Or, thinking back to early Stephen King, he always talked about how he went to a place where he had to rent the typewriters by I don't remember what the increment of time was, but I think he had to put a dime in every time, every like 10-minute increment or 15-minute increment, and he had to make sure he got those pages out. But that was his only constraint, is just like how quickly he could get the words out on paper as he was going.
Yeah, you definitely need a backup when you're writing a novel too.
Yes, you do.
Always have a
Print it
backup.
out, put it on a USB drive, put it in a drawer, save it on the cloud, save it to a
Yeah.
different cloud. Just make sure you got backup, and then make sure they're all labeled so you don't lose track of which version, because you're going to have version 4 final dash real final dash 6 dash this is the actual final version slash edit, and hope it's not corrected.
Yeah, okay, so what appeals to you about the horror genre as a creator?
I unlike Dan and Chris too, who I think both grew up like really loving the horror genre. I wasn't exposed to horror or suspense quite as much growing up until I was maybe in middle school, high school. I didn't really grow into a deep love of it until end of high school and college and beyond. And for me, thinking about horror, thinking about suspense, thinking about the supernatural, um, what I really love about it is, especially for someone who's a Minnesota native, right? I tend to stuff a lot of feelings and emotions like way, way deep down, right? But I think for horror and suspense, what it can do for us as both people who love to watch movies, read, as well as like that, those who want to go through the act of creating a story, is it can give you an avenue to either directly or around the edges think about something that fears you about your life, about society, about culture, and figure out a way to maybe process some of those emotions and deal with them the same way that I suppose sleep scientists say that we have dreams and nightmares. It's a way of our subconscious of dealing with things that we don't want to directly think about, but still would impact us and give us a way to relate to it, understand to it, and prepare for it. I'm never going to be in a haunted house where a bunch of poltergeists are coming after me, but still, feeling the fear of just like the change of being in a new home, or the way that my family will change and grow. I think horror can give us a release, if nothing else, to think about like what that means for us and what that can do to us. And so, in addition to that, I think, horror for me, like, and some of the things that I've worked on personally, I think horror has the capacity to be really funny too, and darkly humorous. And I love that element of it where you can be scared, but also like funny things can happen. And I think specifically, um, the Sam Raimi film Drag Me to Hell,
Mm.
which I have loved that film since it came out, and I will always like tout that as one of my favorites. And it is legitimately, I think, really scary at times. There's some great jump scares. It's also in so many different ways incredibly funny. Like there's gross out humor, there's just like funny interpersonal things, and I find that dance between those two, on the surface, maybe kind of disparate sort of genres, but the way that they do blend together really, really well, I enjoy that just a tremendous amount. Another great example, I think, there's in a movie as bleak and intense as John Carpenter's The Thing. I think there's still a lot of really funny moments in there, like guy turning up the radio just to piss off the other guy down the hall after he tells me he's going to turn the music down, or just all of the reactions that you get from those guys when they're tied up on the couch, right, and they're going through the blood test. Like it shouldn't be funny, but there's that release that I think is just a tremendous amount of fun. And then lastly, I'll say about humor, or horror, rather, as a genre, is I love that there is just a rhythm to it that people kind of understand and expect. Like there's a lot of story beats. You can kind of predict maybe like where a story will go, but at the same time, when it's done well, this can still be so organic and surprising and gripping, even though yeah, there's going to be something not around that corner, and that's going to be the false jump scare, but then you go over here and something's going to happen. And even though it's going to happen, when it's executed really well, it can still get you. And I love that about the genre as a whole, is it can be very formulaic, but still have so much room for innovation and surprise and just genuine delight for the audience. Again, whether that's reading a book or watching a film.
Yeah, a good jump scare, you can't beat it. So, okay. So, what do you enjoy most about writing, and what are your challenges?
Uh, it's so many things to like and so many challenges. I think, at the end of the day, I love the act of creation. I love just thinking about what a character could be, what a scenario could be. How would someone react in this particular scenario if they are built in one way, or if they view the world a different way, how does that impact the scenario that they're in? I've always loved just kind of like imagining things and putting things together. Like, I was a kid and playing with action figures and Legos and creating like little, movie things. I'd be up in my bedroom for hours at a time on the weekend, and folks just like, all right, he's doing his thing. He's making his little stories up there. Um, and then the challenge of it, it's whether you're writing a novel or whether you're trying to make a film, especially as you get to be a little bit older, it's just finding the time. That can be the real challenge
Mm,
above all else is, can you sit down and really truly be focused for a couple hours? And how many times of sitting down for a couple hours do you need to get something put together that you're going to be happy with, that you think other people are going to be willing and excited to spend their time with?
yeah,
Mhm.
definitely the challenge of writing is finding the time.
Absolutely.
So, what do you enjoy most about filmmaking?
It's still a very much a creative endeavor, and I love, again, just like figuring out how something is going to look on the screen when you get it lit, when you get it filmed, what the camera angle, what the lens length is going to be at. And as I mentioned before, too, I really do love the collaborative aspect of it, even if it does inherently just kind of change their creative vision. So many of the films that I've worked on in the past, it's never been quite what I expected in my head before. I had sat down to write it on the page or showed up at set to start filming. But I have just like so many good memories of just like, how are we going to figure out this particular shot or get this sequence down, or coming up with a new line of dialogue or joke or something like kind of in the moment that would never have occurred to you. When you're in that initial development phase. And then similarly, when you're putting things together, seeing that story come to life again in a different way and putting all the elements together to bring some sort of a vision to life. It's just, there's just no end of just all the things that can surprise you, but still coming together with a coherent vision and a coherent story to share with people is just really satisfying when you get to that point where you can say, all right, I'm done. Let's render it out. Let's export it. Let's put it up on the screen. Let's take a look at what we made together.
Mm, yeah, I would think the actor's interpretation of the script too would also bring something interesting.
Very much so. Very, very much so. So yeah, it's always a question mark of like, is aside from just like the physicality of the actor, like how are they going to emotionally interpret all the different scenes? Are they going to give a particular line of dialogue a different cadence or emphasis that you hadn't anticipated that kind of changes the meaning or deepens it? And when you have a cast that you're able to work with, and I've been very fortunate to work with some really talented, dedicated people, it brings things to life in such a unexpected way that can be so satisfying when you're on set and give you so many more interesting things to think about when you're in the edit.
Okay, so who are some of your favorite authors and some of your favorite movies?
Oh, I think I'd have to start with movies and filmmakers because that's probably my main focus. I absolutely love David Fincher, Sam Raimi, Billy Friedkin, the Coen brothers. I mean, Minnesota native, so I gotta love the Coen brothers. But I love the Coen brothers. Steven Soderbergh, I really like. A lot of just like standard kind of film bro kind of guy. I like Scorsese. I like Tarantino. I like Nolan. Um, I really like Sidney Lumet. He had an incredible career and just a incredible catalog. Same with Jonathan Demme. And then some of the newer horror guys, Ari Aster, I think, has made some really interesting films as well as Robert Eggers. So a lot of really interesting filmmakers. And horror, I feel like, as a genre, it goes through ups and downs. And we've certainly, I think, in kind of like this streaming era, I think we've seen a lot of new, interesting, really fun things come to life. And there's never been, I think, a better time to see new stuff if you're a fan of horror suspense films. But also, like, I love some of the classics. So I met Demi. I love Silence of the Lambs. I watch that probably once a year. It's just one of my all-time favorite films. Fincher's Zodiac and Gone Girl, and also Mindhunter on Netflix. I'm still waiting for season 3, like everyone else. Evil Dead 2, Drag Me to Hell, as I mentioned, The Thing. I was thinking about some of the more recent things I've watched in the horror genre, and I was like, oh, It Follows came out 10 years ago. That's right. I've not been seeing as many movies as I used to when I was younger, single, and didn't have a kid. But It Follows, The Witch, Hereditary, The Babadook is a really interesting film that I love a ton. I'm about halfway through Barbarian finally, about a year later. And last night I was trying to get through Longlegs before we sat down to talk, so I'd have something a little bit newer to talk about. But I fell asleep about a third of the way through, so I was just too tired. But what I've seen so far, I really like a lot. So there's just so many really wonderful things that are coming out now, and just a rich history of horror films to look back on. A few of my favorites, well, not The Exorcist, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Thing, I both sat down and watched for the first time with Dan when we were younger. So I have really fond memories watching both those films. The Exorcist, I didn't watch with him, but we talked about it quite a bit before and after. I watched that for the first time as well.
Oh, that's a very good list.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sam Raimi and Christopher Nolan are two of my favorite directors too. So
Yeah. Hard not to find things to like.
yeah.
Gosh, what else? So yeah, in terms of films, the Ty West films, the more recent ones, X Pearl. Haven't watched any of those. Yep, those on my list. I did watch Prey last year, which I thought was I really liked it. I thought it was a really good way to kind of build out the Predator universe. Really wonderful performances. And another film from last year that I liked quite a bit that I did have time to watch was No One Will Save You, with Caitlin Dever, who people might know from Booksmart, or I know her as Escapade, the daughter of one of the characters on Party Down, the comedy series. It's a really interesting little supernatural film that I liked quite a bit. As we think about authors, Stephen King, there's so many wonderful things to love. Even his lesser works are always going to have a lot of great prose and interesting characters in them. I love Elmore Leonard too. I think his humor and characterization is just so well done. It's no mystery that a ton of his work has been adapted into some really great television and film. And then lastly, like Cormac McCarthy is, I think, one of the most incredible authors that we have in like a more modern American literature. His prose is so effective and stripped down and minimalist. And his storytelling is as dark as anything that's out there. It's been years since I've read Blood Meridian, and there are still passages that just I will think of when I'm going to bed at night that just keep me awake, of just the brutality described in there, or just the existential dread that he kind of brings to life in that particular story, and along with his other works as well.
Mhm. Yeah. So tell us about some of the other projects you've worked on.
Yeah, so a few other things that I've made that people could find. I did a kind of a long form horror suspense thriller called Bad Habit. It's about a female serial killer, and she is trying to quit her habit of serial killing, and she's doing that through a self-help book. I produced that with some local friends, and directed it with a Minnesota native scream queen by the name of Sarah French, and we shot that over the course of just 3 days. But it's a 20-minute film that I'm really proud of. Another short film called The Garage that I made quite a while ago now. That's sort of a little bit dark humor, a little bit ghost story. Another one people can find online. And then a couple of Flight of the Conchords-esque kind of musical comedy web series episodes that I made with a group called Valley Meadows, also based out of Minnesota. Those are online, and those have all had a little bit of a festival run back in the day, which are quite in the rearview mirror now, but still projects I'm really proud of. As in terms of other projects, I don't think I'm going to be doing any short film production in the near term, but I'm hoping with the publication of Harvest Time, I'm able to go back to a half-finished screenplay that's sitting in the desk drawer and see if I can't turn that into more of a novelization. And at the time, it's untitled, but I describe it as sort of a supernatural spaghetti western. And
Okay.
that's a story that I first started writing back when we were writing Harvest Time, back when we were living in Chicago. So that's a story that stuck with me, and I don't think I'm going to be able to shake it. So I might just need to get it out on paper.
Okay. So have you got anything else coming up?
No, nothing else coming up right now.
Okay. So, well,
Mm,
I guess fans will have to be satisfied with Harvest Time to get
I think
that
so.
next novel then
Yes.
done. Okay. Okay. I think we'll wrap the interview up here. It's a pleasure
Yeah.
chatting with you.
Thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Okay. And that's it for this episode. So bye for now, everyone.